Thank you, Chairman, for a very useful overview of terrorism in Africa and some of its roots. I'm actually going to be speaking today specifically about counter-terrorism in Africa. But before I do so, I'm going to start with a story because it's just after lunch and we could all use something slightly lighter before we get into the heavy stuff. So let me start with a date. The 2nd of May 2011. Now that date will resonate with many people in this room because it is the date that Osama bin Laden was killed. The day is especially memorable for me because that was the day that I received my first death threat. So far it's my only death threat and I hope to keep it that way. I was working in Somaliland, lecturing at the University of Hargeisa. This is the little northern region of Somalia that functions as a fully autonomous state. It wants to be independent, but no one will recognize its claim. As Somalia goes, Somaliland is relatively peaceful, but it is also where many of Al-Shabaab's top leadership are from, including Ahmed Abdi Godane, who was the head of Al-Shabaab at the time. In the morning of that day in 2011, nearly 6 years ago now, the news of Osama bin Laden's death reached us. There were 5 or 6 of us foreign teachers, and we all lived together in a house that was near the main bus stop. We decided to cancel our lectures because we weren't sure if there would be any kind of backlash. Sure enough, there was a backlash. That afternoon, we received a death threat in the form of a text message. The message was in all caps and punctuated with lots of exclamation marks, and it was signed by Al-Shabaab. It read, "We know you killed our glorious leader. We are ready to kill all the foreigners, especially the ones that teach at the university. We know you live in the house near to the bus station." And it ended with a strange benediction, "Happy action." Now, we had no idea how serious this threat was. For a couple of days, the Somaliland government gave us an extra security detail, but that clearly wasn't going to be a long-term solution. So instead, the authorities came up with another plan, which at the time, this plan made no sense to us whatsoever. What they did is they asked us to move house. The new house was in a different area, and it was right next to a mosque. Not just any mosque. The imam of this mosque was the brother of Ahmed Abdi Godane. He was the brother of the leader of Al-Shabaab, and they wanted us to move in next to him. To us, this felt like we were being moved even closer to the threat. But you know what? The Somaliland officials knew more than we did. They knew that by being so close to this particular imam, we would be under his protection. They knew that the rules of hospitality would apply, and that meant we were untouchable. It was the safest place for us to be. And sure enough, 6 years later, I'm still here, so they must have been right. I tell this story because it illustrates some of the themes that I will touch on later. One theme is that terrorism rarely is global. Some Americans can kill a Saudi Arabian in Pakistan, and that results in a South African receiving a death threat in Somalia. Another theme is that effective responses to terrorism don't always involve more guns and more soldiers, especially in the African context. That maybe we should be looking to local solutions more often. Now, let me introduce myself properly. My name is Simon Allison, and I wear 2 hats. The first hat is that I am a journalist. I am the Africa correspondent for a South African publication called the Daily Maverick, and I also write for international publications like The Guardian and Foreign Policy. But I am also a researcher, and I do a lot of work on issues of foreign policy, international justice, and counterterrorism. And I mostly work with an African organization called the Institute for Security Studies, which does a lot of policy research and technical training for both governments and civil society. And it's as a researcher I speak to you today on the subject of counterterrorism in Africa. I am going to talk about the 3 mistakes that have been made when it comes to counterterrorism. But before I get into those, 2 important bits of context. The first is the most important. I have heard many speakers at this conference say that terrorism is the most significant threat that the world is facing. And they might be right. But it is not true for Africa. In terms of the numbers of lives lost, in terms of the geographical area affected, in terms of the humanitarian consequences, terrorism falls behind issues such as conflict, famine, environmental devastation, and bad governance. Countering terrorism in Africa is a priority, but it is not the highest priority. African leaders that argue otherwise are most likely trying to distract from their failings elsewhere. The second bit of context is to realize that the war on terror in Africa has failed. Africa started taking terrorism seriously as far back as 1992, when the Organization for African Unity started discussing it and coming up with ways to counter it. But the threat from terrorism has increased exponentially since then. Even if we just look at the numbers over the last few years, the picture has become noticeably worse. Since 2009, the number of terrorist attacks on the continent has increased by 400%, and the number of deaths by 850%. These are huge numbers. So whatever Africa is doing in counterterrorism, it's clearly not working. So what's gone wrong? With the benefit of hindsight, we can identify three major mistakes. Mistake number one: the response has been overwhelmingly military or security-led. It has been about bullets and beatings and arrests, even if that means sacrificing human rights and the rule of law. All too often, civilians are caught up in the dragnet of counter-terrorist operations. In some countries, torture and extrajudicial killings have become the norm. Now, we know this doesn't work because the numbers tell us so. Terrorism is increasing. We also know it doesn't work because that's what our research has shown us. The tactics are counterproductive. A few years ago, a colleague of mine at the Institute for Security Studies interviewed dozens of former terrorists in Kenya. These were people that had been captured from Al-Shabaab or who had decided to defect. And she asked them a very simple question. What pushed them to join Al-Shabaab? Why did they decide to join a terrorist organization? Overwhelmingly, they told her a story about some injustice suffered at the hands of Kenyan security forces. Maybe they were beaten up. Maybe their brother suddenly disappeared. Maybe they knew someone who was tortured. Whatever it was, that incident of injustice is what pushed them to join. So for policymakers, the lesson here is simple. Indiscriminate bullets and beatings actually help rather than hinder terrorist organizations in the long run. Mistake number two: fighting global wars when we should be fighting local wars. Too often, African leaders ignore local dimensions to terrorism. This makes sense. It's easier to blame terrorism on Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State and talk about the global war on terror and point out that even superpowers can't get it right. But it's much harder to admit that the root causes of the violence might actually be things like inequality, corruption, bad governance, brutality. Because if leaders admit to these problems, then they have to find solutions for them. The funds on offer from the United States help to distort this picture, help to make the narrative more global. Overwhelmingly, the United States is a major funder of counterterrorism operations for militaries and police on the African continent. But of course, this funding comes with specific objectives. This makes sense. The US is acting in its interests. But African leaders have sort of embraced this narrative that they are fighting a global war rather than a local one. Nowhere is this more obvious than in Somalia, where the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, is largely funded by foreign powers, specifically the EU and the US. All too often, however, the emphasis from these powers is on a military and security-led response, meaning that AMISOM's efforts have been directed largely towards containing and suppressing Al-Shabaab, rather than working towards a stable, peaceful, and inclusive Somalia, which may ultimately involve working with Al-Shabaab rather than fighting them. By focusing on the international rather than the local roots of the problem, leaders are missing opportunities to improve the situation, and sometimes deliberately avoiding the responsibility to do so. Mistake number three: failing to implement good policy. African leaders aren't stupid. They know that things must work differently, and at the very top levels have agreed to do so. At the African Union, the continental body, member states have agreed to a comprehensive counter-terrorism framework that prioritizes regional cooperation and reaffirms the continent's commitment to upholding human rights. This is good policy, or at least it would be, if it were implemented. Unfortunately, few states are actively adhering to the AU's progressive guidelines that leaders have agreed to. So that's the mistake, not actually doing what we say we need to do. This is a crucial moment in the fight against terrorism in Africa. When the continent first started its counter-terrorism efforts, no one really knew what worked and what didn't. But now, at the very least, we know what didn't work. So we need to try something different. This message is especially important right now. Global rhetoric on terrorism is hardening, along with the rise of insular populist governments, and that may encourage African governments to continue their security-led response. But more brutal crackdowns will not be the solution. The continent must resist the hawks and securocrats who urge African governments to repeat the brutal military counterterrorism policies which have failed pretty spectacularly over the past few decades. Instead, as difficult as it might be, and as much patience as it might require, we need to respect human rights and the rule of law. We need a holistic, multi-level approach that addresses the concerns of citizens and engages civil society, community leaders, and religious institutions at all levels of society. Earlier today, we heard the Chief Minister for Chhattisgarh, Dr. Raman Singh, outline how his state had tackled terrorism by focusing on eliminating corruption, improving health and education, and creating more jobs. That is exactly the kind of model that African countries need to learn from. Thank you for your time today and the opportunity to address you, and I look forward to any questions.